For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini, author of the critically acclaimed Borderline in 2004. William Dicey is in conversation with Polity about his TED book titled 1986. So, William, thank you very much for your time. I am a bit fascinated by your decision to focus on the year 1986 in our country's troubled history. What factors drew you to focus on this particular year?
Hello, Sane, and thanks for the opportunity. I was actually researching another project to do with the 80s in general, and the more I read, the more I became interested in the history of the 80s in general. And in a sense, this book is about the 80s. 86 is kind of a device for telling the story, and 86 in some ways was probably the key year and the most interesting year, but broadly the book is about the 80s.
And through focusing on 1986, you are able to remind the readers about many things that might have been forgotten, like the attempts by the apartheid state at reform and repression, and the life under a state of emergency, and even the attacks by the vigilantes. Why do you think it is important to remember these things?
I think I say something like this in the afterword, that any nation that loses touch with its past, with sort of what really happened, is in danger of being sort of taken over by populists and revisionists. And I just sense that there's, with regard to all aspects of our history, there's either a kind of amnesia where people either willfully or accidentally forget, or there's a kind of rewriting. People remember history in a way that suits them, particularly political people, in a way that suits them to remember it. So I thought it was important to just sort of say it like it is. I don't really have an angle on the 80s or 1986 other than being fascinated by what was happening and presenting it as such to the reader.
And William, in chapter 1, you tell us about how the band of vigilantes, they invaded that small town, Motor Village, in fact, following an instruction from Pretoria on the 1st of January. Can you briefly share what happened that day?
So basically, in KwaNdebele, which the government in Pretoria wanted to, I'm trying to even remember what their grand program was. They were trying to make KwaNdebele bigger so that it could justify being an independent homeland. And so they were encouraging, not directly, there was a lot of vigilante action in 1986 whereby the government would support conservative groupings of sort of elder Black businessmen and people that had a vested interest in the system as it was. And they would encourage them, sometimes arm them. Certainly the army and the police would look the other way to deal with the radicals that were fighting against the government. So what happened in KwaNdebele was that the youth and the radicals were causing a lot of trouble, as they would have put it. And this vigilante group called Mbokodo went in and grabbed out of Mutsi, which wasn't actually even in KwaNdebele, went and grabbed hundreds of men and boys and took them off to this hall in Siyabuswa, the capital. And it's quite a fascinating story. I mean, they threw oil over the floor of the hall and soap powder, so it was very slippery, and then made these people they'd captured exercise until they dropped, and then they beat them with whips, and this thing went on for 24 hours. It was truly horrific. But it's quite emblematic of the year where a lot of the government's dirty work was done for it by vigilante groups, a sort of divide and rule way of keeping control.
And you also tell us about the hardships Black people had to endure after they were moved to Mutsi, when they had to go to work in Pretoria using the Porco Buses. Can you briefly tell us about that?
That's actually from a little bit earlier. So this is my method. Once I start a story on a specific date, so the story we're talking about actually happened on the 1st of January, that invasion of Mutsi by the vigilante group. But then, since I'm talking about KwaNdebele, I tell a story that goes back to 1983. I mean, it would have been going on for a long time, but in 1983, an American journalist called Joseph Liliefeld, along with the South African photographer David Goldblatt, they decided to climb onto a bus in Kwandebele, which is something people did every single day, to go and work in Pretoria and then take the bus back to Kwandebele. And the reason they chose to do it is the bus rides were epic. This was part of the idea of keeping South Africa white. So Black people would come and work in the country. They didn't consider Kwandebele to be part of the country. So Black people would come into the country to work and leave again in the evening. But some of these people were on the buses for 8 hours every single day. So the bus that Lilieveld and Goldblatt caught was at, I think, 2:45 in the morning. And the bus was packed. And then they followed this bus for 3 or 4 hours to Marabastad in Pretoria. And yeah, so I just retell that story of the madness of how Kwandebele came to being. It was more like a sort of labor dormitory, really. That's the kind of best description of Kwandebele. Some other homelands, the more established ones, not to defend them, but maybe Transkei, Ciskei, there was a sense in which people created lives there to some extent at least, but a place like Kwandebele was just a labor dormitory and nothing else. And Putco, the government spent more on subsidies for Putco because people couldn't afford to bus for that many hours every day on their salaries. The government spent more on Putco than Kwandebele's entire GDP, just the Putco for Kwandebele, just to run these buses. I mean, it was truly crazy.
And the Alexandra Riot, if I may call them, in the book where you talk about the 6-day war, which took place there, between around 29 and 46 people died. Can you briefly tell us how the funeral of that young boy, Michael Diradingwe, sparked violence?
It wasn't actually a political killing, the killing of Michael Diradingwe. There'd been some altercation outside Jazz supermarkets in Alexandria, and he'd been shot. But there had been so much political stuff happening at the time that it was like a last straw for the community. And there were huge night vigils at his funeral. And the police and army's way of dealing with it was to attack the mourners with tear gas and etc. And the whole thing just evolved into absolute madness for 6 days. Alexandra was actually a little bit behind in political protest at the time, but by the end of the 6-day war, it was really at the forefront of what was really being called the urban rebellion.
William, are you able now to reflect on the impact of PW border state of emergency, the impact that it had in our economy at the time?
The economy, I didn't look into too closely. I mean, the economy was shattered for a number of reasons. Part of it trying to run these huge homeland bureaucracies. So while his state of emergency might have caused sanctions, which might have hurt the economy, I mean, a lot of historians are unsure whether that was a key damage to the economy. The SOE, the state of emergency, the one he declared, the countrywide one he declared in the middle of 1986, certainly had the effect the government wanted, or one of the things the government wanted to do was to tamp down the resistance and the violence. And it certainly had that effect. I know that F.W. de Klerk in his biography he admitted it was a heinous draconian measures, but he seemed to, with a little bit of pride, be saying, well, at least it worked. And at least it caused the ANC to realize they would never win by violence, because we are able to crush them and therefore they are forced to talk. But that's kind of revisionist history. I mean, talking did start in late 86 once the rebellion was being crushed. But it's not clear that that was because of the state of emergency. Also in 1986, the Cold War was coming to an end. Reagan and Gorbachev started talking to each other and agreed to stop funding these civil disputes all over the world. So the ANC stopped getting weaponry, the Nats stopped getting American support. So that was a big thing. And sanctions were huge. The EU, the Commonwealth, the US, a lot of those sanctions came in 86, actually. Something else that happened is the Eminent Persons Group from the Commonwealth came to promote this idea of negotiated settlement and negotiated dialogue. And the idea started to take hold, particularly with Nelson Mandela on the ANC side and Kobie Coetzee, the Minister of Justice, on the government side. So a lot of these other things were helping to calm the situation down. So I'm not sure that F.W. de Klerk's correct to single out the effectiveness of the state of emergency in tamping down the violence.
And we know that around that time, Nelson Mandela was still in prison. And leaders like Thabo Mbeki and Oliver Tambo were in exile, yet they also feature in your book. What were these key figures doing at the time?
Nelson Mandela had a pretty interesting year in 1986. So late in 1985, he went for, I think it was a prostate operation in hospital. And his wife, Winnie Mandela, was flying down from Johannesburg to Cape Town. And on the plane, she saw Kobie Coetzee, the Minister of Justice. And she marched up to business class and sat down next to him. And they talked for 2 hours. And she obviously charmed him because Kobie Coetzee arranged to see Nelson Mandela in hospital soon after that. And that was just a courtesy call. But both of them had then started getting the idea. They mentioned, I think, in that first conversation, the idea that they should start talking. And then Nelson Mandela had to get permission from Oliver Tambo and from Thabo, well, not so much from Thabo Mbeki, but from the leadership in general. Thabo Mbeki was more junior at that point, certainly from Oliver Tambo and the leadership. Nelson Mandela needed permission to start talking to Kobie Coetzee, else they might think he was off on his own mission and ignoring them and making his own deal. So George Bizos was twice sent off to Lusaka earlier in 1986. Well, I think once late in 1985, once early in 1986, to go and get permission from the ANC leadership. He had to go twice because once he went to pose the question, and then the ANC were like, we need to consider this, we will get back to you. And he went back again to get the answer, and they were happy with that. And so then Nelson Mandela tried to get hold of Kobie Coetzee again to talk to him and didn't get an answer several times. But eventually he did get an answer. He got driven out of Pollsmoor to Kobie Coetzee's residence. This is near the middle of 1986. And that's kind of when the talking began. And I mean, there are other kinds of talking that one could also target. But for me, that was one of the main strands of talking starting in 1986. So just on the blurb of my book, I think we start off by saying the year of the vigilante, the year of the necklace, but also the year the talking began. So it was a key year in that sense. It was the last year in which a civil war looked like it could still happen. The talking had gone far enough by 1987 that even Joe Slovo was saying, I think we will settle by negotiated settlement by 87. And P.W. Botha was also saying that. But in 86, it could have gone anyway. I mean, I think of the 400 plus recorded necklacings in our history, 300 of them happened in 1986.
Wow.
And the vigilante action was wildest in 1986. Nicholas Haysom, who wrote a book about the vigilantes called Mabangalala, he identifies between March 86, when the small state of emergency, the partial state of emergency ended, and June 86, when the countrywide state of emergency started. In those 3 months, he says, was the key vigilante time. So it was a key year for violence and a key year for talking starting.
William, can you briefly tell us about the rebel sport tours that were also being arranged during this time?
I mean, probably something to amuse and white South Africans and to keep them, I don't know, distracted. So there were a lot of cricket tours in the 80s, I think starting in 82 with an English team called the Dirty Dozen. And what the government was doing through its cricket boards and rugby boards was going to, I mean, countries wouldn't tour us. There were sanctions, obviously, and the Glen Eagles Agreement from 1977, and there was Olympic boycotts, all kinds of sport boycotts. And South Africans obviously are sport crazy. The government would get, or the cricket board in this case, would get aging cricketers from other countries to agree to make, say, an English 11, which wasn't representing England, but they were all English and they were somewhat over the hill usually, and paid them huge amounts of money to come and tour. And early in 1986, an Australian team came with Kim Hughes as its captain, and they toured. And then nearer the middle of the year, the New Zealand Cavaliers toured. That was a rugby team. That was actually an extremely strong team because the year before, the New Zealand All Blacks were supposed to come, the proper team. And there was an outcry in New Zealand and that was cancelled. And of the 30 players who would have come, 28 actually came the next year illegally. And again, got paid vast sums of money to do so. And I go a bit into what happened on the tours and the history. You kind of remind me that, just to mention that there's quite a lot in the book that is not just pure politics. I mean, I tried to give a sense of what was happening in the country at that time, what it was like to live. So there's sport, as we mentioned, there's literature, there's music, there's theatre. I try to fit in some of these other things as well to answer the question, what was it like to be alive in South Africa in the mid-80s?
Yeah. And lastly, William, do you have your last thoughts about this year, 1986, that you would like to share with our viewers?
Read the book, I think.
That was William Dicey in conversation with Polity about his book titled 1986.